When it comes to managing Hashimoto's and improving our symptoms, one of the big keys is identifying things that irritate our immune system, reducing those triggers to the best of our ability. That way, our immune system can function better and our thyroid can heal. If we want to make progress, an area that I think is critical for us to focus on is our nutrition. Did you know that there are different ways that food can react with our body and therefore perpetuate symptoms and limit that progress? Well, in today's video, we're going to look at all the different impacts that food can have. That way you can better understand those interactions, which will ideally lead to better outcomes with your health. Hey guys, I'm Dr. Bodle, and if you like learning about the best natural strategies to improve your Hashimoto's symptoms, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you're interested in working with me, hang with me until the end of the video so you can get more details about my online course. Now, to illustrate our points today, we are going to use wheat as the example, because depending on the individual, that wheat will affect them in different ways. And that can tell us a lot about how we need to support your body as a whole. But the first type of food reaction we want to focus on is our classic immune system mediated food reactivity. And the way that we can think about this is that it is similar to the way our body would react to some sort of an infection. We've talked before about how our body knows that if it were to get any sort of infectious bug into our bloodstream and into our system, it could cause a whole bunch of problems for us. And so it's always on the lookout for any type of foreign proteins that enter our digestive tract. Our immune system has a huge catalog of all the proteins that make up our own body. And it can use that catalog to cross-reference the things that it's being exposed to from our environment and from our digestion. If we see a large complex protein that doesn't look familiar to us and doesn't match any of the proteins that we have in that catalog, then it's much more likely that that protein is associated with some sort of bacteria or virus, which means we may want to start to initiate an immune response to make sure that we're protecting our body. Now, quick note here, when I say the word protein in this type of context, I'm not referring to the amino acids and the proteins that we receive from high protein foods like steak, chicken, fish, and eggs. Instead, every food out there has a protein signature, even something like an apple, which we might not typically think of as a food that has protein in it. So no, an apple isn't a good source of protein like a steak would be, but the protein signature that we're referring to allows our body to sort of read that food like it would be looking at a barcode. It's a way that we can identify it and determine whether it's something that's healthy for us or something that requires more of a reaction. So it's this ability of our immune system to be able to read and identify these proteins, which allows us to have tolerance for foods that we want to bring into our system, while also protecting us from potential infections. However, if autoimmunity is present, this is also an area where things can get a little goofed up. These proteins that we keep talking about have a certain sequence, pattern, and shape to them. And the way that our immune system reads those patterns is by using antibodies. Antibodies, which help us to deal with infections, also have a particular shape to them. And they're designed in a way to fit to those proteins that we're trying to manage and potentially rid the body of. This is why we often talk about if someone's exposed to a particular type of infection, well, the next time that they come in contact with that same infection, they're better equipped to deal with it. That's because upon initial exposure, we don't necessarily have the antibodies that fit to that specific infection. However, next time it comes around, the immune system's ready and it says, yep, I've seen this before. All it needs to do is call up the order for the particular antibody which it's made before. It can then start producing higher numbers of that particular antibody. And since essentially that research and development phase doesn't have to occur again, it can now respond much more quickly. It can stop that infection before it ever really gets started, and that can minimize our overall symptoms. But what if the shape of a protein in an infection or a certain type of food has a very similar shape to a protein in our own body? And what if that protein in our body already has these antibodies developed for it and our immune system is reacting to it? Well, what we just described there is a piece of the autoimmune puzzle. With autoimmunity, in addition to making antibodies that help protect us from infections, our immune system isn't working properly. And it also makes antibodies that tag specific proteins within our body. If those antibodies and our immune system become too reactive, it can then damage those target proteins and it can impair the function of the part of the body where those proteins reside. With Hashimoto's, typically the target proteins include the TPO enzyme and the thyroglobulin protein. These enzymes and proteins help us to build and create thyroid hormone. And if we start to attack them, then it can lead to damage, inflammation, and decreased thyroid function over time. This is why when we're trying to assess thyroid autoimmunity, one of the things that we want to do is include TPO antibodies and TG or thyroglobulin antibodies on our blood panel. It's a critical piece for us to understand, and a lot of times doctors leave it out of the assessment. But the reason why this is important for us to understand is, as we alluded to before, these thyroid proteins have parts or sections of them that are similar in shape and sequence to some of the proteins that are found in wheat. So if your immune system is unstable and it's already primed to react to a particular protein structure, then anytime your immune system becomes flared up or it's exposed to these types of proteins, there is an increased likelihood that more damage can occur. Think of it almost like one of those old-timey Western wanted posters. There's a sketch or drawing of a rough-looking Western outlaw, and maybe he has a big silly beard. And because those wanted posters are placed all over town, well, all the townspeople are on the lookout for someone who looks like the guy on the poster. Well, if the next thing that happens is someone from out of town comes in looking for a place to stay, and they also have a big beard, then it's very possible, especially if these townspeople are already sensitive to the idea of this outlaw coming into town and they're all riled up, that they could react negatively to this person, whether or not they're the guy that they're looking for. So even though wheat isn't inherently a bad food, if our immune system is sensitive, and because wheat has certain proteins in it that looks like proteins in our thyroid, it creates this perfect storm where when we continually expose ourselves to those wheat proteins, it can trigger an immune response, and that can lead to collateral damage where our thyroid is also impacted. So again, that's our classic immune or antibody mediated reaction to food. It's based on the protein structure and identification of certain foods that can then cause our immune system to react poorly. Typically, the amount that we eat doesn't have as much of an impact, and instead, it's the frequency with which we expose ourselves to these particular foods. The more strangers that come into our town that look like the bad guy, the more our townspeople are going to be on edge, and they might make rash decisions. In these scenarios, we want to limit our exposure as much as possible. That way, the immune system can calm down, become more stable for us, and that can give our body the opportunity to heal more effectively. But what if wheat isn't necessarily a problem for you? Or you've identified that it is a problem for you, and the way that you've started to manage that is by choosing grains that are gluten-free. Both of these are certainly possibilities, but what if you're continuing to have symptoms? Well, that's because protein and immune-mediated reactions to foods isn't the only thing that can cause us issues. So let's look at the next potential immune system trigger that can come from food, which is blood sugar responses. So, like most things in health, it's important to have a good amount of balance. And usually, if things are too high or too low, it can apply stress to the system, and that can lead to unintended consequences. When it comes to blood sugar, although a lot of people think about blood sugar as only being a problem in the context of something like prediabetes or diabetes, for people who have thyroid changes and therefore changes in their metabolism, they can also have a difficult time regulating their blood sugar, which can then cause glucose fluctuations that, in and of itself, can be a trigger and perpetuator for our Hashimoto's. So again, let's say you don't necessarily have a problem with the proteins in wheat like gluten. Is it possible that eating wheat could still be an issue for you? And the answer is yes. Independent of the protein signature and the antibody response to a particular food, there are also other components within that food that can affect our physiology and the way that we respond. When it comes to wheat, wheat is a grain and it has a high carbohydrate content. Again, sometimes this might be something that our body needs. But if we already have changes in the way that our body manages blood sugar, and we tend to be more sensitive to things like dietary carbohydrates, then eating a food with a lot of carbohydrates in it, even if the proteins are tolerated, can still induce large glucose fluctuations within our bloodstream. So remember the signs that we want to look for to help us determine whether or not we might be having a problem with blood sugar regulation. If you're someone who feels tired or sleepy after eating a meal, or if you notice that you have symptoms before eating and those symptoms resolve after you eat, then both of these scenarios suggest that there is a change in function and physiology based on the fuel that you're providing your system. Ideally, we want to be able to eat and have no changes in our function. We should only be hungry before a meal and satiated after. But there should be no changes in things like energy levels, headaches, anxiety, ability to focus, and the like. So even though you might be doing a great job of selecting foods that don't cause an immune response, it's still very possible that you could be having a reaction to food based on the change in blood sugar. And oftentimes, this is driven by your response to dietary carbohydrates and how many you're consuming at a particular time. So sure, maybe you've started to avoid wheat and that's been helpful in certain ways. But if you're still waking up groggy in the morning, feeling like you need more sleep, skipping breakfast because you're nauseous and you don't feel like eating, wanting some sugar or carbohydrates or caffeine midway through the morning, then feeling tired and headachy around 3 to 4 p.m. Finally, our dinner goes pretty well, but we often are looking for sweets around 8 or 9 p.m. Once we get to sleep, our sleep is restless, then we wake up in the morning and get to start over. Again, I'm not saying the choices or changes that you've made already are bad, and they very likely could have been extremely helpful. But I want to point out that you might need some further refinement because we can react to food in different ways. Finally, one of the last common reasons why we could be reacting to food doesn't come necessarily from the food itself, but it comes from our own physiology. And that can be due to a decrease in our digestive capacity. As we've said before, our digestion and our thyroid health are intricately linked. And that is primarily due to the fact that the digestive process requires a ton of energy and a ton of metabolic inputs. If our thyroid isn't working properly, then it makes it very difficult for our digestive process to be effective. So remember how I said that every food has a unique protein signature? Well, once that food is identified, those proteins still need to be broken down because that's how we absorb nutrients into our body. We take these large, complex food molecules and we break them down into their individual component parts. If we can't do that, then this is another part of the process that can be a bit of a red flag to our immune system. If something is resisting breakdown and digestion, well, maybe that's part of a bacteria that doesn't want to be digested. And the further down that complex protein and molecule makes it into our digestive tract, the more likely it is to set off some alarm bells. But what if we have a regular, well-tolerated food that shouldn't give us any issues, but because our digestive capacity is impacted, we can't break that food down as we normally would? Well, you can probably see where I'm going with this. Even if the food is quote unquote healthy and well tolerated, if we can't break it down, it might look more like a bacteria that's trying to resist that breakdown and cause us harm. So what does our immune system do in response to that? Well, it could engage all of its resources and flare things up just as though it was responding to some sort of an infection. This response can be further exacerbated if it is a food that we traditionally have some issues with. So some of those proteins in wheat, one of the reasons why they can pose a problem for us is because they are a little bit more resistant to digestion. So if they normally don't break down well, and our capacity to break them down is impaired, then it's much more likely that this food is going to engage and irritate our immune system. But again, It's not necessarily the food that is at fault here, although there is some influence. Rather, it's our own digestive issues that are making things more difficult. So if you have food reactions that vary, meaning sometimes you can eat a certain food and it doesn't cause you any problems, and other times you can eat that exact same food and it can cause you symptoms, or if you're reacting to just about everything, even healthy foods, and you have a number of symptoms like reflux, digestive discomfort, bloating, and changes in bowel movements, then in addition to assessing what you're eating, it also might be a good idea to work on supporting that digestive system. Typically, what you'll see is as your digestive system improves, some of those foods that you thought for sure were things that you couldn't have and things that you would react to actually aren't as much of a problem for you anymore. That doesn't mean that there won't be certain foods that will continue to be problematic for you, but in general, your gut should be much more tolerant and it should allow you to choose a more diverse array of different food options. But in closing, I think the biggest take home point is understanding that our response and interaction to food can be multifactorial. And the reason why one person might react to a specific food could be for a completely different physiological reason than another. But if we can pay attention to our symptoms and track those patterns, then we can really key in on the areas that we need to support. That way we're managing those immune triggers and seeing the improvements that we want to see. So if you change your nutrition and you've seen improvements in some areas but not others, don't lose hope yet. Leverage the positive and be aware that you might need to make some additional modifications based on those other aspects of your physiology. And by stacking some of that understanding and strategies, you'll be able to continue to make further improvements. But as always, I hope that you like this video, and if you have any questions, leave them for me in the comments below. And if you're someone who feels like you need some more help and you're interested in working with me, you can start that process by sending an email to contact@seattlethyroidhelp.com and asking for more information regarding my online course, Natural Hashimoto's Transformation. In the course, I'll help you to understand your Hashimoto's better than you ever have before, while also providing you a clear plan of action to make real changes and improvements in your symptoms. To do so, we include strategies like nutrition, exercise, supplementation, stress management, gut support, hormonal support, adrenal support, and more. Not only do I think this is the most comprehensive way to address your Hashimoto's, but it's also presented in a very thoughtful and common sense manner. That way you can actually implement these strategies and receive the benefit. Again, if this is something that sounds like it might be a good fit for you, make sure to reach out. You and I can hop on a call and we can see if you qualify for the course. If you'd rather keep learning on your own, check out some of the other videos here on my YouTube channel. Follow me on Instagram or Facebook for daily tips, strategies, and information, or you can grab either one of my free downloads, which are linked in the description box. But that's it for this one. I love you guys, I care about you guys, and I hope that you're continuing to do well. As always, thank you for subscribing and being part of the community. But my name is Dr. Bodle. I hope that you guys have a great rest of your week, and I will see you in the next one.